It began not with an announcement but with a silence so deliberate that even seasoned palace aides hesitated to speak. Behind closed doors, King Charles III summoned only one person, not his heir, not his council, but Catherine, Princess of Wales. What followed was a moment that would quietly fracture centuries of royal tradition before the world even realized it had changed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It was a meeting that was never meant to leave the walls of Clarence House, carefully scheduled, quietly logged, and almost immediately buried beneath layers of royal discretion. No senior courtiers were called in. No private secretaries were invited to observe. Even the usual procedural rhythm, the presence of documents, aides, or legal oversight was stripped away, leaving behind something far more unsettling: intention without witnesses. Reports suggest the summons came with unusual urgency, delivered not through standard channels but through direct communication, signaling that whatever was about to unfold required absolute control. When Catherine arrived, composed as always, the atmosphere inside was said to be unlike anything typically associated with royal audiences, less ceremonial, more deliberate, almost as if the weight of history itself had been condensed into that single exchange. Insiders whisper that a sealed document, its contents known only to the king, was placed before her, not as a formality but as a turning point. And while no official record confirms what was written, those familiar with internal palace procedures suggest that such a gesture is never symbolic, it is decisive. When Catherine emerged, she did not speak. She did not signal distress, but something had shifted. Her composure held, yet the stillness in her expression told a story the palace would not. Staff who encountered her reportedly described a moment of quiet gravity, as if she carried something far larger than a routine briefing. Almost immediately, instructions were issued behind the scenes. This meeting was to be logged under restricted classification, its details inaccessible even to senior administrative channels. That alone was enough to trigger unease among those who understand how rarely such measures are taken. And then came the whispers, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore, that the traditional line of succession, long considered untouchable, had been quietly reinterpreted. The absence of Prince William from this moment only deepened the mystery, raising questions no one inside the institution was prepared to answer openly. Because in a system built on order, hierarchy, and unbroken continuity, deviation is never accidental, it is intentional. And whatever passed between Charles and Catherine in that room was not just a private exchange of words, but the beginning of something far more disruptive, something that would ripple through the monarchy in ways few could yet comprehend. But what was exchanged in that room wasn't just symbolic, it was a decision that would challenge the very foundation of royal inheritance. For over 1,000 years, the British monarchy has followed one unbreakable truth: succession is not chosen, it is inherited. And yet, in early 2026, something shifted, not publicly, not constitutionally, but quietly, through mechanisms few outside the palace truly understand. What makes that shift so unsettling is not simply the possibility of change, but the way it unfolded beneath the surface, inside a system that prides itself on continuity above all else. The rules of succession, shaped through centuries of law, reinforced by acts of parliament and traditions guarded with near-sacred devotion, are designed to eliminate uncertainty. The heir is known. The future is mapped. And in that structure, Prince William has always stood as the undisputed next sovereign, a figure prepared over decades to inherit, not just a crown, but the full weight of an institution built on permanence. But history, as controlled as it appears, has never been entirely immune to influence. There have always been moments, quiet, calculated, rarely acknowledged, where power moved not through law, but through proximity, trust, and necessity. It is in those moments that the monarchy reveals a different side of itself, one that operates not in public declarations, but in internal adjustments, subtle recalibrations that redefine authority without ever appearing to break the rules. Central to that hidden framework are instruments like the letters patent, documents that, while rarely understood outside royal circles, carry immense weight within the institution. They do not rewrite succession outright, but they shape roles, responsibilities, and access in ways that can alter the balance of power without triggering constitutional crisis. And according to those familiar with palace operations, it is precisely within these gray areas that the recent shift began to take form. Reports suggest that King Charles III, facing mounting pressure from both personal health challenges and the demands of a rapidly evolving monarchy, began exploring ways to secure stability beyond the rigid framework of tradition, not by removing the heir, but by reinforcing the system around him. And that distinction, subtle but profound, has become the center of growing speculation. Because while William remains the future king, the present reality appears far more complex. Insiders whisper that Charles has long viewed the survival of the monarchy as dependent not only on lineage, but on capability, the ability to command trust, maintain composure, and carry the institution through uncertainty without fracture. And in that calculation, one figure has increasingly stood apart. Catherine, Princess of Wales, has, over the years, evolved from a supporting presence into a stabilizing force, someone whose influence extends, quietly but unmistakably, across both public perception and internal dynamics. Her ability to navigate tension, to maintain calm under scrutiny, and to embody continuity without demanding attention has not gone unnoticed within the highest levels of the palace. As concerns over stability intensified, particularly amid Charles's ongoing health struggles, the need for a steady, unshakable presence became more urgent. And it is within that urgency that the line between tradition and adaptation began to blur. Because while the monarchy may appear unchanging, it has always survived by adjusting carefully, quietly, and often without acknowledgement. The question now is not whether that adjustment has occurred, but how far it has gone. And if the whispers are true, then what began as a private effort to preserve continuity may have already reshaped the very structure it was meant to protect. And it was precisely that stability, calm, controlled, and unquestioned, that made Catherine the center of a decision no one saw coming. The document was never meant to be seen. Not by the press, not by the public, perhaps not even by the wider royal family. But according to multiple palace insiders, its contents were unmistakable. A declaration, a designation, a shift of power wrapped in silence. What makes it more unsettling is not just what the document reportedly contained, but how it was handled, sealed, restricted, and quietly circulated among only the most trusted figures within the inner royal framework. Those familiar with internal palace processes suggest that documents of this nature are never casual. They are deliberate, crafted with precision, and designed to carry authority without ever needing public validation. And this one, by all accounts, did exactly that. Reports suggest that King Charles III used the document to name Catherine, Princess of Wales, as what insiders are calling an operational successor, a term that does not exist in official constitutional language, carries undeniable weight within the internal structure of the monarchy. It does not remove Prince William from his place as heir. It does not rewrite the line of succession, but it does something far more complex. It separates symbolism from function. It draws a line between who will inherit the crown and who may, in the present moment, carry its operational authority. And that distinction, quiet, technical, almost invisible to the outside world, has become the center of growing unease within palace walls. Because if one person is the future king, and another is entrusted with present control, then the balance of power is no longer as clear as it once was. Insiders whisper that interpretations of the document vary widely, even among senior aides. Some see it as a temporary measure, a way to ensure continuity during a period of uncertainty as Charles faces ongoing health challenges. Others believe it represents something far more significant, a subtle restructuring of influence, designed to stabilize the monarchy without triggering public scrutiny. And then there are those who view it as a risk, a move that could create confusion within an institution built on clarity. The division is not loud, not visible, but it is their quiet conversations, careful wording, decisions that carry an extra layer of hesitation. At the center of it all stands William, whose reaction, according to those close to the situation, has been described as controlled but deeply reflective, not resistant, not confrontational but aware. Aware that something fundamental has shifted, even if it has not been openly acknowledged. And perhaps most striking of all is Catherine herself. Reports suggest she did not accept this role lightly, that her initial response was not ambition but hesitation, Because to step into such a position is to step into uncertainty, to carry authority without title, responsibility without precedent, and scrutiny without clear definition. The timing only intensifies the weight of the decision. With Charles's health continuing to raise concerns behind the scenes, the urgency to secure stability has grown sharper, more immediate, and far less forgiving. And in that urgency, choices are made not for tradition, but for survival. The monarchy, for all its permanence, is not immune to pressure. It adapts, it adjusts, it protects itself in ways the public rarely sees. And this document, hidden, debated, quietly powerful, may be one of those moments where adaptation begins to reshape the very structure it is meant to preserve. But while the palace struggled to contain the revelation, another question began to surface: why Catherine, and why now? To the public, she was the composed future queen, but behind palace walls, Catherine, Princess of Wales, was facing a reality far heavier than any title. Because what she had been given wasn't just responsibility, it was power, and the consequences that came with it. For years, her rise within the royal structure had been steady, almost understated, shaped not by sudden ambition but by quiet consistency. She learned the rhythm of the institution, absorbed its expectations, and gradually became something more than a supporting figure. Insiders whisper that her influence did not arrive overnight. It was built through countless moments of restraint, diplomacy, and control, particularly during times when the family itself seemed closest to fracture, when tensions surfaced, when public narratives threatened to spiral. It was often Catherine who remained the fixed point, the one presence that neither escalated nor retreated, but held the line. That role, once informal, slowly became essential, and over time what began as trust evolved into reliance. Reports suggest that senior aides increasingly viewed her as a stabilizing force, someone capable of navigating both public scrutiny and private complexity without losing balance. But stability, in a system built on hierarchy, can be both strength and threat. Because the more central she became, the more visible her influence grew, not publicly, but internally, where power is measured less by titles and more by proximity to decision-making. And that shift did not go unnoticed. Within certain royal circles, there were murmurs, quiet, controlled, but unmistakable questioning whether her role was expanding beyond its traditional boundaries. Not openly, not in a way that could be challenged, but enough to create tension beneath the surface. The comparison to Queen Elizabeth II began to emerge, not as a declaration but as a reference point. A standard of endurance, composure, and unwavering duty that Catherine seemed, in the eyes of some, to echo. But with that comparison came weight. Because to be measured against such a legacy is not an honor alone, it is a burden, one that demands consistency without failure. And unlike Elizabeth, whose path to the crown was defined by clear succession, Catherine now found herself navigating something far less certain. The expectations placed on her were no longer implied, they were absolute: to maintain unity, to preserve image, to carry authority without overstepping it. To balance the demands of the monarchy with the realities of her own life, she decided to take a break from her royal duties, where she is not only a royal figure, but a mother, a partner, and a person whose private responsibilities do not pause for public duty. Insiders suggest that this balance has become increasingly difficult, not because she lacks capability, but because the role itself has no precedent. There is no defined structure for what she has been asked to do, no historical framework to guide her decisions. Every step forward is, in some sense, uncharted, and that uncertainty carries its own form of pressure, the kind that is never spoken, but always present. Because when expectations are unspoken, they cannot be negotiated. They can only be met, or not. And in a system where failure is not an option, the cost of maintaining that balance becomes deeply personal. The calm she projects, the control she maintains, the composure that defines her public image, all of it comes at a price rarely acknowledged. Yet despite that, she continues to move forward, not with visible resistance, but with a quiet acceptance that suggests understanding, even if not agreement. And it is that acceptance, more than anything else, that reveals the true weight of what she has been given. Because power, when granted without clarity, is not freedom, is it responsibility in its most demanding form. And as Catherine began to step into this unprecedented role, Not everyone within the palace was prepared to accept it. The monarchy has always thrived on unity, at least on the surface. But beneath the polished appearances, cracks were beginning to show. Because a decision of this magnitude doesn't just reshape roles, it reshapes loyalties. What had once been an unspoken understanding within the institution, clear hierarchy, defined. Authority, unquestioned succession was now quietly shifting, and with that shift came something far more volatile than disagreement: uncertainty. Insiders suggest that within days of the internal designation becoming known to select circles, conversations began to change tone, not openly, not in ways that could be traced or challenged, but subtly, through hesitation, through carefully chosen words, through the absence of the usual certainty that had long defined royal operations. Senior aides, long accustomed to clarity, now found themselves navigating a landscape where authority was no longer singular. And in a system built on precision, even the smallest ambiguity can create fractures. Reports indicate that divisions began to form, not dramatic, not visible, but present. Some aligned themselves with continuity, holding firmly to the established structure centered around Prince William as the future sovereign. Others, more pragmatically, began to acknowledge the emerging influence of Catherine, Princess of Wales, recognizing that operational authority, even if unofficial, carries its own form of power. And then there was the question of Queen Camilla, whose position within this evolving dynamic has become a point of quiet speculation. Those familiar with internal palace relationships suggest that influence within the monarchy is rarely static, and when new centers of authority emerge, existing ones are inevitably affected. While no direct conflict has been confirmed, shifting balance has raised questions about how influence is being redistributed behind closed doors, and whether long-standing dynamics are beginning to change. At the heart of it all lies a deeper concern: precedent. Because if the monarchy begins to separate ceremonial succession from operational authority, even in subtle ways, it introduces a level of flexibility that has historically been avoided, not because it is impossible, but because it is unpredictable. And unpredictability is something the institution has always worked to eliminate. William's position, once straightforward, now carries a complexity that cannot be easily defined. He remains the heir, the future king, the central figure of continuity. Yet the present moment appears to be unfolding differently, shaped by decisions made not for tradition, but for stability. Insiders describe his response as measured, strategic, and deeply aware of the implications not just for himself, but for the monarchy as a whole. Because this is not simply about roles, but about perception. And perception, in a system so deeply tied to public trust, is everything. Outside the palace, the narrative remains carefully controlled. Official statements maintain consistency. Public appearances follow expected patterns. Nothing, at least on the surface, suggests disruption. But the media, attuned to even the slightest deviation, has begun to sense that something is different. Not through confirmation, but through patterns subtle. Shifts in engagement, changes in presence, decisions that do not quite align with established norms. And while speculation remains cautious, it is growing. The palace, in response, has done what it has always done in moments of uncertainty: it has closed ranks. Silence has become strategy. Information has become controlled. And the more tightly the narrative is managed, the more it invites the very scrutiny it seeks to avoid. Because silence, in an institution built on visibility, does not erase questions, it amplifies them. And as those questions continue to circulate, both within and beyond the palace walls, one reality becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Something fundamental has changed, even if it has not yet been acknowledged. But silence, in a system built on tradition and visibility, only made one thing certain: the truth would not stay hidden for long. It didn't come as an announcement. There were no headlines, no formal declarations, just subtle changes, appearances, decisions, authority quietly shifting hands. And for those paying close attention, the pattern became impossible to ignore. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A scheduling adjustment here, a solo appearance there, a decision attributed to internal coordination rather than individual direction. But over time, those small deviations began to form a rhythm, and that rhythm began to tell a story the palace was not ready to confirm. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was no longer simply participating in, royal duty she was leading them, shaping them, moving through them with a level of independence that had previously been rare, if not entirely absent. Reports suggest that key engagements, once routed through traditional channels, were now increasingly influenced by her office, with decisions reflecting a clarity and decisiveness that insiders describe as both efficient and quietly authoritative. It was not a dramatic takeover. It was something far more controlled, more deliberate. A transition that did not demand attention, but gradually commanded it. Observers began to notice shifts in representation moments where Catherine stood not beside others, but ahead of them, guiding the tone, setting the pace, defining the narrative through presence alone. And while no official statement acknowledged this evolution, the consistency of these changes made them difficult to ignore. Those familiar with royal protocol understand that positioning is never accidental. It is calculated, intentional, and deeply symbolic. And when those symbols begin to change, they signal something far more significant than appearance. Royal watchers, long trained to interpret even the smallest gestures, are on the lookout for any sign of trouble. Began connecting these moments, forming conclusions not from speculation, but from repetition. Journalists, cautious at first, started to ask questions not directly, but through analysis, through comparison, through the quiet recognition that something within the structure had shifted. Yet the palace remained unmoved in its response. No confirmation, no denial, just the same carefully maintained silence that had defined this situation from the beginning. And that silence, rather than containing the narrative, began to shape it. Because in the absence of clarity, interpretation becomes inevitable. The more the palace withheld, the more the pattern spoke for itself. Insiders whisper that internally the adjustment was already understood, even if it had not been formally declared. That those within the system had begun to operate with a new awareness, one that acknowledged Catherine's role without needing to define it. And perhaps that is what made this moment so powerful, not the presence of authority, but the absence of resistance to it. Because power, when accepted without question, becomes something far more enduring than power imposed. The narrative, once contained within palace walls, was now beginning to reach beyond them, carried not by statements, but by observation. And as those observations multiplied, the line between speculation and recognition began to blur. What had started as a quiet shift was now approaching something far more visible, something that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or routine. Because when patterns repeat with precision, they stop being patterns and start becoming reality. And as that reality began to take shape in the public consciousness, the monarchy found itself facing a moment it could neither confirm nor deny, only navigate. And as the world began to realize what had happened, the monarchy itself stood on the edge of a transformation it could no longer control. Every monarch leaves behind a legacy. Some are defined by tradition, others by change. But in his final chapter, King Charles III may have done something far more profound. He may have redefined what succession truly means. For decades, his vision of the monarchy has been quietly evolving, shaped not only by history but by the growing realization that survival in a modern world demands more than preservation, it demands adaptation. Reports suggest that long before the current moment, Charles had begun to question whether tradition alone could sustain the institution through the pressures of a rapidly shifting public landscape. Not openly, not in ways that would alarm the establishment, but internally, through conversations, through decisions, through a gradual rethinking of what continuity should look like when certainty begins to fade. And it is within that quiet evolution that the present situation begins to make sense. Because what appears on the surface as disruption may, in reality, be a calculated attempt to protect something far more fragile than power itself, the stability of the crown. Those familiar with his approach describe it as deeply pragmatic, rooted in an understanding that while the monarchy is built on history, it cannot remain frozen within it. The challenge has always been balance how to honor centuries of unbroken tradition while responding to the demands of a present that refuses to stand still. And in that balancing act, decisions are rarely simple. They carry consequences that extend beyond individuals, shaping the perception, credibility, and endurance of the institution as a whole. Within that framework, the emergence of Catherine, Princess of Wales, as a central figure begins to take on a different meaning. Not as a departure from tradition, but as an extension of it, continuity expressed, through capability rather than strict adherence to form. Insiders suggest that Catherine represents something uniquely aligned with Charles's vision: stability without rigidity, authority without disruption, renewal without rejection of the past. And yet, this interpretation is far from universally accepted. Within royal and public discourse alike, a debate has begun to take shape, quiet but persistent. Does this move strengthen the monarchy by preparing it for the realities of the modern era? Or does it risk undermining the very principles that have sustained it for generations? History offers no easy answers. There have been moments before controversies, adjustments, decisions made under pressure that tested the boundaries of royal convention. Some strengthened the institution, others left lasting fractures. And it is within that historical context that the current shift is being measured. Because the monarchy does not exist in isolation. It exists through perception, through trust, through the belief that its structure is both stable and justified. Any change, no matter how carefully executed, carries the risk of altering that perception. Yet at the same time, refusing to change carries its own risk: the slow erosion of relevance in a world that demands responsiveness. This is the paradox at the heart of Charles's legacy. To preserve, he must adapt. To protect, he must redefine. And in doing so, he steps into territory where certainty no longer exists, only judgment. The weight of that decision is not measured in the present, but in what follows, in how the institution absorbs, responds, and ultimately evolves. Because legacy is not simply what is left behind, but what is set in motion. And if the whispers surrounding this shift are true, then Charles has not just made a decision, he has initiated a transformation, one that will shape the monarchy long after his own chapter has ended. The question is not whether that transformation will succeed, but how it will be remembered. And whether, in choosing adaptation over tradition, he has secured the future of the crown or placed it on a path no one can fully control. And in redefining that legacy, Charles may have set into motion a future that no longer follows the rules of the past. The crown has always endured, through wars, scandals, and shifting generations. But this moment feels different, because for the first time in centuries, the future of the monarchy may not rest where everyone expected, but where it was quietly placed. What once seemed unshakable now feels subtly redefined, not through proclamation, but through presence. Catherine, Princess of Wales, is no longer simply preparing for a role that lies somewhere ahead. She is stepping into something that is already unfolding. Not officially, not in a way that can be announced or explained, but in a way that is being felt, observed, and gradually accepted. Her influence, once measured and carefully contained, now carries a different weight. It shapes decisions. It steadies perception. It fills a space that until recently had no clear name. And perhaps that is what makes it so powerful, because it does not demand recognition. It creates it. Alongside her stands Prince William, whose role, while unchanged in title, has begun to evolve in meaning. He remains the future king, the central figure of succession, yet the present moment asks something more complex of him: not to step aside, but to step differently, to adapt to a structure that is no longer defined by a single path, but by a shared responsibility that neither history nor tradition fully prepared him for. Insiders suggest that this evolution is not marked by conflict, but by quiet recalibration, a recognition that the strength of the monarchy may now depend not on rigid roles, but on fluid cooperation. And beyond the palace walls, something equally significant is taking place. The public, once guided by clear expectations, is beginning to respond not to titles, but to presence. Catherine's growing visibility, her composed authority, her ability to move through moments of uncertainty without disruption, these qualities are not just being noticed, they are being accepted. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, perception is shifting. What once might have seemed unconventional now feels inevitable, and that shift, more than any internal decision, may be the most defining element of this moment, because the monarchy has always relied on public belief as much as internal structure. Without that belief, even the strongest traditions lose their foundation. Yet for all this movement, for all this quiet transformation, questions remain. Unanswered, unresolved, lingering beneath the surface. What does this mean for the future of succession? Where does authority truly reside? And how far can the monarchy evolve before it begins to lose the very identity it seeks to protect? These are not questions that can be addressed openly, nor are they questions that demand immediate answers. They exist in the space between tradition and change, where certainty gives way to possibility, and it is within that space that the monarchy now finds itself standing at the edge of a new era, one that has not been defined, only entered. Because while the institution has always been rooted in the past, its survival has always depended on its ability to move forward, carefully, quietly, and sometimes without acknowledgement. What makes this moment so different is not just the change itself, but the realization that it has already happened. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually through decisions, through trust, through the quiet shifting of responsibility from one set of hands to another. The crown remains, the structure remains, but the way it functions, the way it endures, is no longer exactly what it once was, and perhaps it was never meant to be. Because endurance is not about remaining the same, it is about knowing when to become something new. Because in the end, this was never just about succession, it was about who the crown chooses to trust when everything else begins to fall away. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.